honor to introduce Pat Confalone for the Earl B. Barnes Award for Leadership in Chemical Research Management. Pat has been an exemplary scientist for many years now. I had the pleasure of working in one of Pat's organizations. He combines technical leadership with business acumen and a real zeal for chemistry. He's a great leader. He's been a real asset to the ACS, and in many ways, he's been one of the real leaders of organic chemistry. And so it's really a pleasure to introduce Pat to give the award lecture. And congratulations, Pat. Thank you very much.
It is my pleasure to have this award address for the ACS Barnes Award. And I'd like to talk about reflections over 5 decades, actually, as an organic chemist. So it's really a pleasure. And I want to certainly thank Tom Stevenson and the 3 speakers, good friends and great friends, but also great chemists that gave superb lectures and really terrific. I put this acknowledgement slide, I took it from the end of the talk and put it up front just to be sure I got it in before the clock runs out on streaming, which is a risk with this virtual talk. So I'm really honored, humbled to receive the Barnes Award. And I'm really forever grateful to the literally hundreds of colleagues and collaborators for their hard work and incredible dedication over the 5 decades of my career. It's really to all of them that I dedicate this award. But a real dedication is to my wonderful family shown here. Of course, that's my son up the top, Nick. He's an Emmy-nominated writer in LA, not too far from Mike Jung. My daughter, Tricia, and this is Nick's wife, and these are the 2 grandkids. But this is the love of my life, who I dedicate this talk and this award to, the lovely Diane. So this was also to be at the end, but I thought I'd put it here at the beginning. Esquire magazine always had a 1-pager called What I've Learned, in which different people gave just bullets about things they picked up over their life or career. So I thought I'd copy that format here and start with this. You can lead a successful high-performance team or take credit for what they do, but you can't do both. Always surround yourself with the best and brightest, and you'll find your career is both highly enjoyable and extremely successful. And don't be surprised when your colleagues' productivity seems to go up when you're on vacation. Never forget that we do serve 2 masters, the company whose logo is on the paycheck and our beloved science of organic chemistry. So patent and publish. Insist that your colleagues strive to be on the stage, not just in the audience. Profit is not a 4-letter word, as we like to say in industry. Never lose the stars in your eyes about chemistry, and you'll never work a day in your life. And don't underestimate the value of using humor in leadership. Throughout my career, I've loved to say, and I really believe this, seriously, they pay us to do this? My story really begins in Roseto Valfatore, Italy, where my grandparents immigrated from at around the turn of the century. It was a poor village, and there was no opportunity in a great recession and incredibly high taxes. My mother's father, Joseph Romano, when he entered Ellis Island, they asked him what his occupation was, and this still brings a bit of a tear to my eye. He wrote down peasant. They all settled in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. Joe Romano became the town painter. And at the bottom of this picture is actually the rest of a ladder he was on with his 4 sons. And one of my uncles said that if we did a really good job, we would get a higher position on the ladder. They would say, just like you, Pat, we could climb the corporate ladder. My father's father, my namesake, Pasquale Confalone. I am actually Pasquale. A lot of people think Pat is short for Patrick, the Irish Italian. He became a slate miner in the slate belt of Pennsylvania. This is a picture of my parents' wedding. So even though they had they couldn't have two nickels to rub together when it came to a wedding, they really did a great job. And so my mother in a beautiful wedding dress with my father. They both were pulled out of school in sixth grade because there were 7 and 8 siblings that had to be supported, and they were one of the older children. So they had a sixth grade education. But my father became a self-made businessman and eventually had a company to manufacture women's blouses he called Nikki Fashions. At its height, it had about 200 employees. And that's why the dream was for their son, an only child, talk about rebellion against large families, to go to college. And that's why when I was interviewed as a plenary speaker at a conference, they really said, "You're living the American dream." And clearly I was. So how did I get interested in chemistry? Well, as a Boy Scout, in the back pages of Boys Life magazine, there was an advertisement from a seed company that said if you sold a lot of vegetable and flower seeds around your neighborhood, you could eventually get a Daisy BB gun rifle, the Red Ryder. And that was my dream. When my mother saw what I was going to buy with the points I had earned, she said, "You'll shoot your eye out. You'll never get that gun." So I had to go for a second choice, which was a Gilbert chemistry set. And that got me hooked on chemistry. So from that point forward, I was in love with chemistry. It's a good thing because instead of the ACS and being on the board and working with the ACS, my logo may be quite a different one today, the NRA. So how did I get to MIT? Well, in my father's blouse manufacturing company, every week the thread man would come. Now the thread man was the guy who would bring the spools of different colored threads that would be used for the different colors of blouses that were going through the factory that week. So the thread man said to my father, "Gee, your son Pat is a junior. What's he interested in?" Well, my dad said he likes science. Oh, and the thread man said, "Well, he got to go to MIT." Well, my father said, "What's MIT?" He said, "That's a school up in Boston." So my dad came home that night and said, "The thread man said, you ought to go to MIT." I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's some school up in Boston." As luck would have it, Life magazine's cover story that week was about MIT with the Great Dome on the cover. And that's how I found out about it, got interested, and they took a chance on admitting a little kid from Rosetto, Pennsylvania, with 29 classmates in my graduating school. In my sophomore year, the late great Professor Dan Kemp joined the faculty and just taught the laboratory part of organic chemistry. He was so inspirational, I changed my major from a new major called chemical physics to organic chemistry. And as I got more and more interested in organic chemistry and synthesis, he told me that there was a professor at Harvard that I should consider for graduate school. Well, it turns out he was talking about Professor R.B. Woodward. Now, of course, he had already won the Nobel Prize for synthetic organic chemistry. So it was really through Professor Kemp's mentoring that I was able to actually get a visit with Professor Woodward and made the decision to go to Harvard rather than Stanford, too bad, and for them, and was able to work for R.B. Woodward. Who also is shown in this interesting rendition of R.B. Woodward, his Benson and Hedges cigarette. So I would like to just talk about a piece of a project from my PhD thesis, which is kind of interesting. And Woodward had said, "How would you like to make a peptide machine?" all right, I said, what's the idea? He said, well, let's consider making an amino acid in which the carboxyl group was a heterocycle instead of a carboxyl group, and find certain conditions that would convert the heterocycle to an activated acid. Condition being that the conditions A and the products of the conversion could only be gaseous byproducts and bubble off of the reactant. The next thing was that a coupling would occur, conditions B, to make the peptide bond with now, of course, again, a heterocycle, but the products of coupling also had to be gaseous. So after a lot of consideration for what the heterocycle should be, we ended up with an azetoxidizole. And for conditions A, what could be better in terms of leaving no byproducts than photochemistry? So we were hoping that an azetoxidizole would lose a molecule of nitrogen to a nitrene, which would reorganize to this diazo compound, and then lose the second mole of nitrogen to make an isocyanide. Now, of course, an isocyanide, when it is coupling, and it is a very good active ester, in fact, unlike, say, an ortho-keto ester, which there's no leaving group, but an isocyanide, it's a leaving group. And lo and behold, the products of that coupling are a gas, HCN. So our early attempt was to start with a chloroaminotetrazole, and then to acylate on nitrogen with an amino acid chloride or some other peptide amide type of coupling. And then if we could get the rearrangement that's shown here with a leaving group, that rearrangement would make this almost unprecedented bicyclic ring system. Now, there was a lot in the literature about the equilibrium between azetamines and tetrazoles. And we were very convinced that if we generated this bicyclic intermediate, it would rearrange irreversibly to an azetoxidizole. Well, we never could really get this to go so smoothly, but we kept working on it. But at the same time, I thought, well, let's just go after the heterocycle itself. So taking Bach phenylalanine hydrazide with CS2 in base, these salts were forming quantitatively. And if one would just reflux that salt, we'd get an oxidizole with alkylatable mercaptide, which we cap with methyl iodide in a very smooth high yield sequence. The methyl sulfide was not a good enough leaving group, but when we converted it to a sulfone, with just 5 minutes, sodium azide and ethanol quantitatively converted to the azetoxidizole. We then removed the Bach protecting group, and now we had both a protected amino acid with a heterocycle we wanted and an unprotected amino acid with the heterocycle. So the key experiment was done. The azetoxidizole was photolyzed in a rayonette. When the starting material was gone and isocyanide was produced, we showed it by IR. We then turned the light off, of course, added the unprotected amino azetoazide, and got a new benzyl group, and clearly had made a dipeptide ready for further reaction. As a model for a tripeptide and the peptide machine, we basically did the following. Taking the Bach derivative of glycine azetoxidizole, photolyzed it to the isocyanide, moles of nitrogen were evolved. We then turned the light off, important to do, added the coupling agent, and we got the coupling to occur, and then turned the light back on and got Bach phenylalanine acyl cyanide, and then just capped it with benzylamine to make the tripeptide equivalent. So that was eventually published And I just wanted to share in my PhD thesis, when it was bound and published, a very nice note from Professor Woodward. It says, in remembrance of and thanks for an enjoyable, stimulating, and fruitful association, and with all best wishes for and the assurance of an illustrious future. October 1st, 1971. Posthumously, we did publish this in JACS. Well, Woodward invited me to join the postdoc group on B12, and I think Peter Jacoby's talk, where he referred to B12, is actually a helpful introduction to what I wanted to mention as a contribution to the B12 work that was very gratifying. So this is, of course, the key publication of the total synthesis of vitamin B12. When I joined the postdoc group, we had the problem of ester differentiation that Peter referred to in his talk. This is cobalamin, or vitamin B12. The key relay compound was cobyric acid, and cobyric acid had been converted to B12. So this was the real target of the Eschen-Moser-Woodward collaboration. The key is the differentiation of the carboxylic acid at the bottom, where all the other appendant groups were carboxymides. So at this point, I joined the work at the front, and the front consisted of making hesperamine from beta cornersterone, and then doing an ozonolysis of the double bond. However, even though that worked okay, and eventually through the aldehyde, mesylate, and primary bromide, that was suitable for going forward, as you can see, we have a tetraester. So there was no differentiation of the esters. So this was a model for how we could make progress from hesperamine, but the problem of ester differentiation remained. So in those days, the front material was so precious, all experiments were done in a UV cell. So I was, at that time, working with a thioketal I had prepared, and I was studying its performance with acid in a UV cell when I felt a shadow kind of looming behind me, and I thought, well, this is probably one of the postdocs. And no, it was Professor Woodward, and we were watching the performance of this. Now, we knew that these oxonium species had a lambda max of around 325, and the corresponding sulfur, which was less known, we thought was at 388. However, when my thioketal was treated with acid, we only got 388 and not a trace of 325, meaning there was a preferential ring opening favoring the sulfonium species. Well, the question then was, hold on. The question then was, could there be a miracle where if we have methanol and a mercaptan present at the same time, when methanol would open the lactam ring, even if the mercaptan opened it, we knew in an excess of methanol, a thioester would hydrolyze to a methyl ester. But anything attacking the carbonyl, the ketone, because of that thioketal presence, could only make the sulfur version. And in fact, it works. We go directly to a differentiated pre-ozonolysis precursor. So looking at a number of derivatives, we found that it works great, but there are side products arising from further ozonolysis attack at the sulfur atom, even the T-butyl case. But the solution was to use thiophenol, and that was now delocalized enough on the lone pair that we got a very high yield of the aldehyde without any of the side product. Esters are very easily converted to the carboxamide with ammonia, and that was served to differentiate the side chain. Just to complete the work, we made the alcohol from the nitrile. When we converted the alcohol to the mesylate, as you would know, it also converted the carboxamide to a nitrile. And as the reactions went forward, the nitrile was carried along with the esters, and at the end of the synthesis, the the nitrile was converted to a carboxamide and conch sulfuric acid. Everything else is stable. It's then converted with nitrization to the carboxylic acid, hexaester, and chlorhydric acid was made very directly from ammonia. And that's how that ester differentiation problem was solved. So I then went to Hoffman-LaRoche, and it has been mentioned, one of my early projects there was to look at new syntheses of biotin. And biotin is very interesting molecule, but the key is that all of the hydrogens present in a contiguous sense are cis. So I had published two syntheses of biotin where the all cis configuration was arrived at by hydrogenation of double bonds, which was also present in the Leo Sternbach synthesis, which was currently commercial. In that case, his double bond was exo to the ring. But I was interested at the time at looking at the starting material of cysteine, which has the right configuration for D-biotin. The very straightforward condensation with benzaldehyde and conversion of the carboxylic acid to the aldehyde gave very beautifully high yield crystalline derivatives. Then conversion of the aldehyde with Vitti chemistry to this important trans double bond gave an interesting intermediate, which I treated with bromine. And as the reaction progressed, the important characteristic smell of bromine was slowly disappearing and replaced with a very obvious scent of benzaldehyde. And what was happening is shown on the next slide. And we'll see more of the participation of sulfur in transannular chemistry, but the bromonium species that's formed is unstable to reaction with the sulfur lone pair, making this bicyclic sulfonium system, which then labelizes the benzaldehyde for retroreaction. And when the smoke clears from the olefinic species, I ended up with this looks like the great intermediate with the bromide appropriately placed for displacement to give the all cis stereochemistry of biotin. So we were thrilled at this result. And then when we eventually reacted the intermediate amino bromide with sodium azide, we got a very interesting result. We had an azetolactam where now the azide was on the wrong side of the molecule. Well, what's going on is we're getting ring closure of the amino bromide to an aziridine, and then azide is opening at the wrong position, and either position would be wrong. But when it opens at that position, the resulting azetoamine is closing to the six-membered lactam. Well, we thought about that rearrangement, and maybe the project was over at this point, but nonetheless, we thought, let's set up an equilibrium without azide. So in this reaction, we converted an equilibrium setup with the original amino bromide, the intermediate aziridine, and as they would go back and forth, only the desired one could cyclize, and that would take the equilibrium all the way to now a bromolactam, which now with lithium azide would give the all cis configuration, and that was converted easily to D-biotin. I thought one of the more interesting ones, and this is also referred to, this apparently appears in a number of organic chemistry talks that professors give to their students. One of the least likely starting materials for biotin would be a hydrocarbon like cycloheptane. It doesn't contain sulfur, no oxygens, no nitrogens, but it does have functionality. There is fortunately an olefin. NBS followed by acetyl thioacetic acid gives this thioacetyl. And then with sodium methoxide and the beta acetoxy nitroethane via a nitroolefin that's formed by that sequence undergoes a microreaction to give this nitroolefin. The best dehydrating agent used in in nitrile oxide chemistry is phenylisocyanate. So this gave directly through the 3+2 dipolar cycloaddition, the adduct shown there, in which 2 of the 3 centers of biotin were set as cis, and we get a 4th one, which we don't want or need as a bonus. LAH with this highly convex molecule installs the final hydrogen in the all-cis configuration, while also breaking the NO bond and reducing the imine at the same time. So now we simply had to acylate nitrogen and oxidize the alcohol, and we were all set for the final carbon hydrogen bond, which we're going to install with a Beckmann rearrangement. So the oxime was easily made, and we only got one oxime because of the steric interaction of having the Z oxime. So that was very good, because that was predicting that we would get the desired Beckmann instead of a mixture of the 2 lactams. However, when we used thionyl chloride and pyridine, we got our old friend the aziridine back. And now, once again, that nasty lone pair on sulfur is participating in a unique Beckmann fragmentation, eventually kicking out a side chain containing a nitrile at the end, which of course we didn't mind, because that would be the precursor for the acid. However, the aziridine was not a desirable outcome. So we thought this could be the end of this game, but fortunately, PPA is a very good way to do Beckmann's, and that in fact worked very well and gave us the precursor we needed. That was converted to biotin pretty readily. Hydrolysis actually couldn't stop the formation of the urea, and that was very stable to further hydrolysis, and that just simply opened up and gave DL biotin directly. So that was a great, I think, example of getting a very unique set of chemical reactions, but starting with the most unlikely of all starting materials for this bicyclic heterocycle. The reaction also works with nitro and olefin cycloadditions, and that, as you can imagine, gives related chemistry. Because of this, I was asked by Organic Reactions to write a chapter on nitro and olefin cycloaddition reactions, which appeared has recently been updated by Organic Reactions. But at the time, this field was exploding, and it was very hard to keep up with the comprehensive table that's required. It was a labor of love that Ed Huey, associate of mine, really helped a lot to put together. So at DuPont, I left Roche to go to DuPont, and at this time, one of the first things we did in central research was develop reagents for the fluorescent tagging of DNA. 72 synthetic steps were required to do this, but these were DNA terminators, and they eventually allowed, when put into the right instrument, to allow for the automated sequencing of DNA, and that became very important for the Human Genome Project, and they were used to facilitate automated DNA sequencing at the time. I won't talk about the discovery and the process research of COSAR, because I've actually given the talk at a number of ACS meetings in the past. But let me just make a few comments. The precursor in MedChem to COSAR had a carboxylic acid at the para position of the biphenyl ring. However, the compound was a great A2 antagonist, but it was not orally bioavailable, and so it was moved to the meta position, and it also was orally inactive. And for some reason, just doing a very thorough carboxylic acid walk, when it was put in this kind of tucked in ortho position, the compound magically became orally active. And so if you're developing an antihypertensive, of course, it's got to be orally active. Well, then we also found that using a carboxylic acid surrogate, a tetrazole, which a lot of medicinal chemists, we always try to do that. Usually it doesn't work very well, but in this case, it gave an increase in potency of 10x. So it became like Cozar at that point, which was great in medicinal chemistry. But then I moved to the process group and was given Cozar as the project. And they said, well, why did I put that tetrazole there? Because the thought of using HN3 and cyanide to make the tetrazole on scale was very scary. And it was a challenge until we realized that the tire industry used an incredible amount of phenyltetrazole, which they would use to explode their tires in the mold. And this was a very available, stable, well-known article of commerce. So with that knowledge and using the late, great Victor Sneakis's directed orthometallation chemistry, we were able to start with phenyltetrazole. And then, as you can imagine, with the ortho-directing chemistry, build up the rest of the Cozar molecule. So that was one of the great successes. And Cozar, over its history, and I have to tell you, I'm on it right now for hypertension. That's kind of ironic. It's sold over $35 billion in sales. DuPont Merck was a joint venture that we started with Merck. And at the time, there was an important project that was in, of course, HIV. We looked at the entire, all the different points of intervention in the life cycle. And Merck had discovered a reverse transcriptase inhibitor, which was a non-nucleoside compound. And so it was given to the process group at DuPont, and we collaborated with the process group at Merck to work on the following compounds. The compound that got commercialized, Sustiva, which has been in about 5 million AIDS patients as part of the original cocktail, is shown here. It's a chloral compound with one asymmetric center. There were two backup compounds that were important, especially these ones where R1, R2 is fluoro. And then the other examples where the triple bond was reduced to a trans olefin, also a difluoro and chloro analog. So our challenge was to do a good process R&D work to make Sustiva something that could be actually developed and marketed. The price of Sustiva when it was given to the process group was $50,000 a kilogram, and with a 600 milligram daily dose of Sustiva required, it would be prohibitively expensive to add to the cocktail at about $30,000 a year. So our first thought was that perhaps we could induce that asymmetric center with the use of a chiral auxiliary. So in the retrosynthetic sense, having the chiral auxiliary, and what's better than cheap alpha-methylbenzylamine, we imagine that if we could have this iminium species generated from a precursor, we could add an organometallic agent or some anion to that iminium species, and hopefully the methylphenols on the chiral auxiliary would induce the correct asymmetric center, and then we could deblock the chiral auxiliary. And all this would go back to a pretty available compound, the amino trifluoromethyl ketone. Now, as you know, the trifluoroketones exist both as the carbonyl and as a hydrate. So initially, we tried to acylate the ketone version, but because of the inability of that nitrogen to act as much of a nucleophile if it was resonating through the carbonyl of a trifluoral methyl group. That nitrogen was essentially almost in our hands, you could not acylate it no matter what. However, it was found that if you did the hydrochloride hydrate, that phenomenon was not present. And so the hydrochloride hydrate became the starting material, and we made the isocyanate of alpha-methylbenzylamine, and it acylated beautifully to a mixture, which then on heating formed a nicely crystalline material, which already showed, interestingly, an 88% DE by X-ray and a very high yield. So that already showed some of the influence of the chiral auxiliary. So that was very exciting. After studying a lot of dehydrating conditions, we found that the best one was thionyl and using a Grignard reagent derived from cyclopropyl acetylene. So thionyl is used, and once you treat the starting material with thionyl a bright red-orange material solution occurs, and we believe that must be this dehydrated intermediate. When the Grignard reagent is reacted, we eventually that color disappears, and when the color's gone, the reaction's essentially over. And we got a 92% DE. Well, that was really good. So we found that the deprotection was best done with formic acid because there was a styrene byproduct, and that was not very good. So this formic acid quenched the styrene byproduct, and we were able to get this. Well, then we had these difluoro compounds. So we did the same chemistry on the difluoro compounds with everybody beating us up to get large quantities of this made. Well, it shows you what fluorine can do. The Grignard reagent on the intermediate, instead of adding where it's supposed to, it reacted with the urea, and we got only this undesirable material. Well, at that point, we started a new approach where we looked at chiral moderators to try to get a chiral bias to the addition and not rely on a chiral auxiliary. So we screened a whole bunch of them and eventually found that this carine derivative, which we published its synthesis in OrgSyn, if you use that and make the lithium salt of the alcohol, when you use cyclopropyl acetylene lithium species, we get a very high enantiomeric ratio, which after it's used gives a 99% EE and a high yield. So that became a great solution to the difluoro. And then, well, we went back and sure, it works for 961, which has the chloro. So this became then the commercial synthesis for 961, giving extremely high EEs and very high yields, not requiring the chiral auxiliary anymore. We were worried about getting the olefins because if LAH didn't do it and give us a very high selectivity for trans, we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do, but extremely high yield, 93%, 200-to-1 trans cis selectivity. So the problems were solved directly, and this was a very scalable reaction, and metric tons were made with the LAH. I'd like to close with DuPont crop protection, which was the next step in my industrial career, and just talk about Rynaxypyr, which is a new class of insecticides acting at the ryanodine receptor. I'll show you a little bit about medicinal chemistry and what it is like. Our lead, and one of the ways of very often of finding how to get active compounds, and Michael Jung referred to screening 7 million compounds in industry, and yes, we do high throughput screening, of course, but one of the other ways of doing it is so-called patent scouting, where you look at other discoveries that have either been in the chemical or patent literature that might be a good way to be a starting point. And in fact, that's what we did with Cozar. So it's not an uncommon and very successful way to get into an active series which you then try to improve and get your own proprietary IP out of it. So the lead compound was this phthalate diamide compound shown here, which had an alkyl amide and an arrow amide shown there. Well, one of the first things, and Tom Stevenson has a great talk on how to do lead discovery. But one of the common tactics when you have amides is simply to invert them and to see whether or not they're just linkers, as opposed to really important from an electron donating or an electron accepting point of view. So we can do a bis amide inversion to the diamine, or we can do a mono amide inversion on the alkyl side or on the arrow side. And increasing activity was observed when we went to phthalate diamides. Well, look at this story. When you have the R group next to the alkyl amide, if you move it to the position ortho to the arrow amide, you lose activity. If you invert the amide on the arrow, you lose activity. But if you do both things that lose activity, you actually increase the activity. So very counterintuitive and very typical of what you do in medicinal chemistry. That then, of course, required optimization. This is a typical SAR slide where you change everything and you just keep making analogs, working with multiple disciplines, because it's also important to have everything right for filing with the EPA. We made over 2,000 analogs with this chemistry. It came down to, timely, I guess, in March, the final 4. So we were down to various chloro or bromo substituents on the alkyl group or on the pyrazole. And if you look at them, you'll see in terms of spectrum and potency that the bromo and methyl were the one that won the final 4. And that became Rynaxypyr. Its mechanism is looking at reacting on the calcium stores, which are gated by the ryanodine receptor. So normally for muscle contraction, there's an action potential, and some calcium is released and you get contraction. With Rynaxypyr, it comes through and opens and keeps open all of the gates, and you get a complete rapid depletion of the calcium store. And that, my friends, is more than contraction, that is paralysis. So if I can try this, I hope it works well. I'm going to show you a cockroach heart. Okay. This is a beating cockroach heart. And you'll see a drop of just a couple micrograms of Rynaxypyr put on it. And this is pretty bad if you're a cockroach, because you see what happens. In just seconds, there's total paralysis and death. So why would we have a compound like that as a potential insecticide to put out in the world? If you look, we all have ryanodine receptors across species, but look at the human one. It's virtually, and you just can't even see it. Most insecticides might have a therapeutic index of 10. Rynaxypyr is 350 to 3,000 times. So it's the world's safest insecticide, which partly accounts, besides its great spectrum, for its $1 billion in sales. In the field, you can see between an untreated check and just 10 grams of Rynaxypyr gives such a great result. It's very easy to see in this slide which row had the Rynaxypyr treatment. It changed the way that cabbage was sold in Indonesia, because they used to be paid by the head. Because Rynaxypyr was giving such great performance, they changed the market so they were paid by the pound. A simple change of chloral to cyanyl gave a new compound, Ciasapir, which opened up an entire new spectrum of insects. And we went from Lepidoptera, which are chewing insects, to Homoptera, which are the sucking insects. So it gives a new spectrum. So now we can go after whiteflies, and you can see the difference between in squash between Ciasapir and untreated checks. Colorado potato beetle, a very destructive material, and here you can see just for potatoes the big difference. The last thing I just want to mention, with a group of 5 or 6 people, we took a lead from our insecticide group and set up a skunk works to do animal health research. And we slowly but surely, with an outside collaborator, found that we could turn an insecticide for ag into a flea and tick companion pet product. And this you may not realize as the name, but you will certainly know it as NexGard. This is an oral chewable that basically will take one chew, and it's a month. It actually goes for about 3 months, but you give it every month. And NexGard is not topical, doesn't get on your clothes, your children. Oily topical is gone. You just basically give this chewable NexGard. It did 900 million in sales last year. So I'd like to close by thanking the DuPont company, where virtually all of my career has been spent for the 5 decades. I thank very much the American Chemical Society and Dow, who actually sponsors the Barnes Award. I so appreciative of Tom Stevenson for emceeing this event, and my 3 great friends and who gave such great talks, Peter Jacoby, Steve Martin, and Michael Chung. And before they start playing the music like they do at the Academy Awards, I would like to thank everyone for their attention. I hope you enjoyed the symposium. And once again, my dedication is to the hundreds of colleagues that made this possible. It's been a great ride. I continue to enjoy doing chemistry in my consulting business. And so I'm making contributions along the lines of medicinal and process chemistry in both the pharma and the ag space. It's a great way to continue to enjoy that chemistry set instead of the Daisy BB rifle. And it's come a long way since then. So thanks everyone for your attention. I appreciate it. And back to you, Tom.